when I was a kid, I was blessed with a lot of Masters of the Universe toys. But oddly, I never had Mer-Man, one of the core Skeletor Masters of Evil, or, Lords of Evil, however you want to call it. Maybe that's what my fascination with him as an adult comes from, is never having him. It's one of the reasons I really like the Origins line, because it helps sort of fill in the gap for those figures we never had as a kid, but always wanted. And the scale, the articulation, the 5-inch figures really bring back that nostalgia. And when Origins was first launched, I was extremely excited. I mean, granted, I had to drive all over town to Walmart to pick them up, and I'm still lacking figures I've been looking for, like Trapjaw, that came out in Wave 2 and only shipped overseas due to the Walmart agreement. But, well, that's a whole other issue. The point is, I've had to pick and choose with Origins. I usually tend to get the figures I like the most, and there have been some fans who have done some cool customs for me, like this Mighty Spectre in Origin style that Juan Soto did for me. Love it! Well, the reason I'm not all in on Origins is honestly because I already have a complete Masters of the Universe toy line. I have Masters of the Universe Classics, which I got to brand manage at Mattel. And it's not just because I worked on the line, but that line has done over 300 characters, castles, vehicles, etc. So I kind of feel like I already have my complete He-Man collector line. But there are characters that really appeal to me, or ones I didn't have as a child, that I feel like Origins is helping me fill in those gaps. But I'm a little iffy because some of the details tend to be off, like He-Man's hair color or the color around the boots. It's not quite a recreation of the old toy, it's more of an interpretation. Beastman's another good example. If you look at the mouth, or Man-at-Arms, again, the colors aren't quite right to the vintage toy. But there's a lot of fun to be had with Origins, which is why I picked up, I think, my 5th or 6th Origins figure, which was Lords of Power Mer-Man. I got him at Walmart last week, and although I was a little surprised, he came up to like $18. I thought these were like $14 figures, but hey, inflation, what can you say? So, as noted, I never had Mer-Man as a kid, and I passed on the original Mer-Man from Origins, which was a recreation of the vintage figure, the retro figure. I don't know what you call them these days. Now we have all this retro and vintage lines for every brand, but he wasn't the original Mer-Man for Origins didn't look like the cross-sell, which I kind of hoped it would, because I thought that's kind of what Origins was about, was sort of going back to the original versions. And this was the original version of Mer-Man, noting his head and his shin guards and his gloves. Looked the most different than any other figure on the cross-sell. Granted, Man-at-Arms had the fur around his armor, and Zodak was a little bit different, but Mer-Man noticeably, when you were looking at that original 8-pack, very different from what showed up on the shelf. Head, completely different. And why is this? And why did they continue to use this image for years, knowing it wasn't what the final toy looked like? The head was completely redesigned, the coloring on the boots and the gloves was missing, and we're going to get into why that happened in a moment, but it's very interesting how Mer-Man stands out as this character that didn't match the toy. When it came time to doing classics, the 6.5-inch line that we did on Matty Collector, obviously we wanted to do a head that was reminiscent of the actual original toy that people owned. But, and Eric from the Four Horsemen will hugely agree on this point, was classics provided the opportunity to do a second head and to give the Mer-Man that we always sort of wished we had, the one that was shown on the cross-sell that we were kind of denied getting, if you will. And this tends to be my go-to Mer-Man head on my classics figure. I don't even use the other head because looking at that cross-sell as a kid, this was the Mer-Man you wanted to get. It was kind of like, the prince that was promised, the Mer-Man that was promised. We were supposed to get this cool Mer-Man with this amazing fish head, and instead we got something that was a little slimmed back. Now, why did the cross-sell head look different? Well, it goes back to the origins of the line. The original concept art for Mer-Man had details like this, as well as a lot more details on the armor. And you can see this design showing up in a lot of the early promotional materials, and especially in the original mini-comics, were based on the concept art because the mini-comics were done before the toys were ready to ship. So the only reference that the artists had was to look at the original concept art and the original prototypes. So you can see Mer-Man here in a sort of more a blue-skinned version in the mini-comic, as well as having those extra details on his armor from the prototype image or the concept art, like those little dangles from his belt, And the head obviously being very different, having that more fishy look versus kind of a, I don't know, rodent-y look that the revised head got. Doesn't quite have that, aqua feel to it. Now, we did do the blue Mer-Man from the mini comics in Classics, albeit it wasn't completely on model because he lacked those little dangly things from his belt and on his boots. So I will say it's cool that Origins did this. When you compare the Classics version, it's just a straight repaint. He was just repainted. It was the existing Mer-Man from Classics. Granted, we only did the alternative head because, again, we wanted to match the comics. Now, the mini comics by issue 2 or 3 had reverted to a green skin Mer-Man without the little extra armor pieces, but still kept the different head. In fact, the original mini comics were all about armor. Everyone's armor gave them their powers, which is why you see Mer-Man trying to steal He-Man's power harness here. And, of course, there's the other versions of Mer-Man that showed up in later mini comics, where suddenly he has like a red head and a blue lip, and that version was made by Super 7 in their reaction line, which was pretty cool, because it's always great to get alternate versions of characters, especially when there's reference in the vintage material, but this really isn't the Mer-Man we love. Alright, so back to the origins of the line, when it was called Lords of Power, before the name was changed to Masters of the Universe. There were some executives who felt Lords of Power was too religious. At PowerCon a few years ago, when Origins launched, they put out a Lords of Power 5-pack of some of the main characters from the line, but based on more of their concept art and, more importantly, not just the art, but the prototype toys that were made, where, again, you saw things like Mer-Man having those little dangly things on his armor, and Beast-Man had slightly different armor. You can actually see here in this comparison shot, it's recognizable as Skeletor, but there's slightly different aspects. The face is a little bit more melty and less skull. Beast-Man loses some of the spikes on the armor and the wrist guards going all the way up his sleeve, as well as the enlarged belt buckle. But it's cool because, this concept art and these prototypes do exist, mostly in photo form. I don't think the actual models are around anymore, but it was really cool that I thought this was actually what Origins was going to be going for, was more of, where Motu was, shall we say, in 81, 82 versus what happened in late 82, 83 when it made it to the shelf. All right, so looking at the original launch, you can see that they're all very, very basic bodies. In fact, there were 3 basic bodies created. You had your human body, which was used for characters like He-Man and Man-at-Arms, just with a different head and different armor. It's what made the figures so inexpensive to produce, because once they had the main body buck, well, you could make anyone. Same thing, the second body was what was called the Reptile Body. This was the one that was used by Skeletor and by Mer-Man, and it had the fins on the arms and the 3-toed feet, although there were 2 different versions of the legs with 2 different boots, with armor and then with more of a sort of organic-y armor. And then, of course, there is the Beastly Buck, which was the hairy buck. This was used for Stratos and Beast-Man, and was basically a character covered in fur. And again, unique arms and legs with fur, a unique chest. Zodak, which was a late add to the original lineup, was sort of a mixed match. He had some hairy parts from the Beastly book, he had some human arms, reptile parts for the feet. He was sort of a mix and match, but it showed the diversity of characters you could get from just these 3 basic body types: human, reptile, and beastie. I mean, obviously Teela had her own body, but that's not important right now. All right, so back to Mer-Man. So Mer-Man had to be conceived to use these shared parts, and that's one of the reasons the figure was changed from the cross-cell, because the cross-cell required more unique parts. It required a head that was a little bit more difficult to produce and deco. So the head was cost-reduced and changed to simplify it, to make it work better for the simple shared body execution. And because one of the most expensive parts of a figure is actually paint, he lost some paint ops on his arms and legs, on the boots and gloves. Now, it's also interesting to note that the head used for Mer-Man wound up getting reused later in the line for Stinkor. So, yet another reason why I'm glad that we did the alternate sort of prototype cross-cell comic book, mini-comic version of Mer-Man's head, because that way he stood out next to Stinkor and didn't look like he just shared his head. Alright, so, going back to the original cross-cell, and seeing how all of the figures had to use these shared bodies and shared parts, which made it easier to produce, and it also made it more cost effective. So a great example is on Skeletor. Originally, he only had, I think, about 5 deco hits on his face. And then eventually, later in the line, he got 2 additional hits on the cheeks to make the face pop a little bit more. You can see sort of that red-orange that's on the left and right side of his face. Now, this was done by removing deco from another place on the figure. So the original release of Skeletor had a paint op that went all the way around his boots. Later releases, they didn't paint the back of the boot because those paint ops got reallocated to the face. So it's the same number of paint ops on the figure, call it 10, but they just moved where the paint went. All right, so back to Mer-Man. So we talked about him getting cost reduced from a face standpoint and losing the deco on the gloves and the boots to make it more efficient and more cost efficient, I should say. But what about the version of Mer-Man? So, like I said, in the original mini-comic, he had blue, he had the extra details on his armor, which would have required unique armor, unique boots, and those were removed in order to use more shared parts. So this Lords of Power Mer-Man that I bought last week was interesting. I bought it because I felt like, oh, this is a cool chance to finally get a 5-inch Mer-Man figure in scale to my vintage figures that looks like the cross-cell. But it doesn't actually look like the cross-cell, and there's a few issues with that. One is the way he's painted. So he does get the gloves, but the boots are painted all across his feet in the Origins figure, not just the shin guards like he has in the cross-cell. So you can see, obviously, he has more paint on him. This is the Lords of Power version from PowerCon, where he gets more of a blue skin tone, and his accessory gets that extra deco hit up the middle to have the sort of the blue energy running up the yellow corncob pipe. So that's compared to the single-carded version, reused the boots and the belt from this Lords of Power PowerCon version, but it doesn't make it correct to the cross-cell, which is what leaves me sort of scratching my head, is all the parts exist in Origins for Mattel to have created a perfect cross-cell Mer-Man. They did a perfect vintage figure Mer-Man, and that's what sort of confused me, is when I got my Lord of Power single-carded Mer-Man, it's not quite the mini-comic Mer-Man, and it's not quite the cross-cell Mer-Man. It's sort of a hodgepodge between mini-comic with the danglers, the green skin from the cross-cell, but he has more deco on the boots. So yeah, the one that we got for PowerCon is basically straight out of the mini-comic. Perfect. We got the danglers, we got the little details on the boots, the reverse dangles, I don't know what you'd call those, and again, the extra deco on the sword. Now here with the single-carded release, the skin color is changed to more of a traditional green, but we still have the dangly things. And when he had green skin, he was never shown with the dangly armor. I know, I'm getting really picky here, but I really wanted a Mer-Man that looked like belonging in the vintage line. Well, I know people have wanted a Mer-Man looking like the animated series too, so they finally got that, at least in 6-inch form. But the point being is that Mer-Man's got a lot of looks, and finding the right pieces to combine together to create the exact look you want, mini-comic, concept art, cross-cell, it requires patience, timing, and understanding. I hope you enjoyed this video and it was a good look at why Mer-Man's face changed in the vintage cross-cell and why there's a little disappointment with the current version that's not quite any version of Mer-Man. It's kind of like a mix and match of different versions. Details are important, and that's what makes the toy industry a lot of fun and why it needs more collectors. If you like this video, please give it a like, a share, tell others about it. It's the best way to support this channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.